Hey everybody, welcome back to our continuing series on Leonardo the Lion finishing tutorials. Today we're going to be sewing on Leonardo's head. We're going to be seaming his head to his body. So if you haven't already sewn his little chest applique on, this is the time to go back and watch that video and seam on his little chest applique, because this has to be on before we sew on his little football head. So the first thing that Brenda says to do is to pin, well, obviously after seaming his head together and stuffing it, is to pin, let's just leave that open, pin his head to the front. So it says, pin head to front of body, chin should overlap top edge of chest applique by about 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters. So I'm just gonna, you see that? Yeah. So I want his chin to be right about here, so only a little bit of that triangle shows. So when I pin it down, this might take a couple of tries to get it just right, but I'm gonna end up seaming right here when I come back and pin and eventually seam his head on. So I'm just gonna stick a T-pin right there. And then the next part of her instructions say to seam the back of his head using a strand of CC2 to the top seam right here. So I'm just going to take another pin, even though she doesn't say to pin it. I'm going to take another pin and just stick it in over here just to secure it, just so I can kind of see how his head is going to sit once it's sewn on. So if you see that, pin there, and pin back here, right there. And I like the way that sits. It's going to sit a lot more securely once it's all seamed. It's going to give it a lot more structure, but I really like the way that this is looking. So let's go ahead and seam the back of his head. So I'm going to lay him down right here. I'm actually going to flip him like this, because I think that you'll be able to see a bit better this way. Yeah. So I have a couple of pre-cut little strands of the required color for seaming, and I cut my seaming tail a bit long here for a reason. So let's just thread our tapestry needle here. And the head of this T-pin is all the way over here, and it's just kind of hanging on for dear life. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into his head under a stitch. So if you haven't seen my previous tutorial videos, I've been using a simple Rotaro mattress stitch for basically every seam that I've done so far, including the ones that I did previous to filming these tutorials. I knit all of Leonardo's body before these tutorials, so I used a mattress stitch to close his hands, to seam the top of his shoulders, to seam his little crotch area together, all of that. So this is just a really simple, effective way to seam all of his parts together. So, well, you can see what I'm doing. Yep, you can. So I'm just going under a stitch on the body. And you can pull these will get tighter once you start going a little bit more. So I'm going under a seam on the body and then under a seam on his head, stitch. And we're just going to keep going all the way across. Now all of these seams are going to get hidden by his mane. So that's the last thing that we're going to attach in this tutorial series is his lovely mane. So all of these seam lines are going to get hidden, including the one that's going to be under his chin, because his mane comes out. So he's got a beard. So just keep that in mind while you're working on finishing him. And don't be too hard on yourself if it's not perfect, because this is a very forgiving project. So no worries about that. So you just keep, sorry about that guys, didn't mean to shake the camera there. So just keep going. So you can see that this side is a little loose. We're going to secure that once we're all done seaming across. Okay, we're nearing the end of our seaming here. So the great part about this is that you don't feel like you've sewn on enough on either end. You can go back, and because I cut a nice long tail like this, I could go back and seam more here, but I actually think this is great. Looking pretty stable. I'm gonna pick it up just to show you all what it looks like. So here's his neck so far. It's pretty stable. Here it is from the front so far. Now his chin is still pinned onto his body right here, but I really like the way this looks. So what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to leave these tails out just in case I end up wanting to seam a little bit more on the back of his neck. And I'm going to start seaming his chin down. So I'm going to take my strand of gold leaf here of a contrast of the main color, and I'm going to start doing a similar type of seam on his front. So I don't really need this here anymore. Just gonna smooth out my fabric and decide where to start. So these seams are more like you're tacking his head down securely. So you don't have to seam as vigorously as you would in other places where you're sewing in stuffing. Because obviously you're not going to be stuffing the area in between his head and his body. So nothing's going to be escaping from there. We just want to make sure that his head isn't too floppy. A little floppy is okay though. You want it to wiggle a little bit because he is a stuffed animal after all. And floppy stuffed animals are very endearing. So just like I was doing on the back, I'm going under one stitch from the body, one stitch from the head. So I'm stitching into the applique directly here. My tail keeps on getting stuck in his foot. Like I said, just a reminder that his mane is going to cover up this seam because his mane is going to be attached all the way down through here along the seam and under his chin and then all the way around. So no need to worry too much about how perfect these seams are. as long as they're functional and not too bulky and not too crooked, they'll be fine. So I want to kind of end my seam in the same general area as where I started, so it's symmetrical. So that seems about right. Now I really like the way that this is looking. It's hard for you guys to tell on camera, but his head is not flopping around all that much, but just for safety's sake, I'm gonna just do a little extra seaming here and here to keep him from getting a little too floppy, because obviously if you're gonna give this to a kid or an adult that really loves squeezing stuffed animals, I don't want his head to get loose before it's time. So let's just give him a little extra on both sides. So basically I'm just seaming all the way up to the top edge of his chest applique here on this side. And if you feel like you want to do this part too, absolutely go ahead and do that. I don't think it's really necessary, but I'll just show you what that looks like. You just go under, stitch on the body, and then through the head in the same area. Your yarn is probably going to get stuck on his hands and stuff as you're sewing. It's okay. So I think this is fine. It's very secure as it is right now. So what I'm going to do is run my tail down through his chin and out the bottom of his chest applique here. And just like before, I'm just going to give it a little snip and set that waist yarn aside. I go back to the other side and just finish up the same way. And up and above his chest applique, into his body. Great. So I'm just going to do one more stitch across his seam, the top of his shoulder seam, like so. And then go through and up through his head for this one. Same deal on this side. Just gonna go kind of, there's just a seam here, which is why it looks like my needle, my tapestry needle is struggling a little bit, because I'm just going underneath that seam. And then back up through his body. Pull. There you go. Oops, sorry about that. So there it is. There's his head sewn onto his body. And I think that looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. So stay tuned for his ear seaming out. Now I'm just going in order with Brenda's finishing instructions, aside from the tail, which I sewed on earlier in an earlier tutorial. It doesn't affect the rest of the seaming, which is why I did it, but stay tuned for the ears next. Thanks, guys.